Okay, so today we have our client David with us. David is an ultra marathoner who actually started running ultras when he took early retirement in his 50s and has now been doing it for about 5 years. And he's been seeing us at the clinic for a number of years as well. So, David, hello, and thank you very much for sharing your story with us and our clients.
Hello, Catherine. Yeah, that's no problem.
Could you tell us a little bit about why you decided to do ultra marathons? And just for a little context for people, every year David runs the 100-mile Lake
Lakeland,
District,
yeah, it's Lakeland 100, they tend to call it.
the Lakeland 100, and
Yeah,
just recently completed it was coast to coast, right?
yeah,
300 kilometers.
that's right.
So he does really long distance ultras. So yeah, so how did you get into it?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, just to sort of put into context, I've worked around London for many years now, sometimes in central London, sometimes just outside, office based. And over the years, I've done quite a few half marathons and very much was in a routine of doing half marathons. But as I got older, I started to get niggles training for half marathons. And in particular, I know around 2014, I had a problem with my knee, a Baker's cyst, which stopped me running for a couple of years. And then a few years later, I just found that going out running in Epping Forest, which I'm lucky enough to live nearby, was far less problematic for my knees. And then soon afterwards, I took early retirement, had far more time than I used to have. So I finally got my act together in about 2017, and I signed up to the Lakeland 50, which is the 50-mile version of the Lakeland 100, in July 2018. That's how I got into it. I did the Lakeland 50 in July 2018, and that went quite well. I was fast enough to get a qualifying time to enter the Lakeland 100 because you have to have a qualifying event to go in for the Lakeland 100. So I decided as I wasn't a spring chicken, I better get on with it. So I entered to go into the Lakeland 100 the following year in 2019. So basically, I was training through the latter half of 2018 and the first half of 2019. And I was trying to take a more, I guess, a scientific approach to my training than I've ever done before. And so I started thinking about, things like stretching, rollering, and, considering other things like sports massage. Um, you know, Previously, whenever I had a niggle, I would have gone to a physio, and you get the same sort of, looking back on it now, you get the same sort of interactions every time. You get a set of things to do to stop things hurting, and very much, sort of unstated or unwritten thing is. And once that pain's gone, you just go back to what you were doing before. No real attempt to actually get to the bottom of what's going on. Why do you have these problems, and trying to sort them? So I was keen to explore other things. In the run up to the Lakeland 100 in 2019, I visited a sports massage person up in the Lakes who was also an ultra runner, and that seemed quite useful. So when I came back home, I was looking around, tried a few places, and it just didn't particularly hit it off. And then I saw, I'm assuming it must have been via a Google search or something. I saw Leighton Sports Massage advertising for Runners MOT. So my initial visit was I came and saw you in, I think it was April 2019, to have us run as MOT. And I've been coming ever since, basically.
Yes.
And I think, I found the runner's MOT process useful, just really sort of standing back almost, not looking at a specific problem, just thinking, what is going on in my body when I'm running. And, you know, basically, I've carried on with you ever since. And, it's been very effective.
Hmm. And what would you say, because you mentioned that you saw a few other sports massage places before you came to us. What would you say you feel the difference is between the way that we work at the clinic versus what you'd experienced with some of the other sports massage therapist places that you tried?
Um, I think an understanding of me as a runner, what I'm trying to achieve, and I guess particularly as an ultra runner. And the couple of places I had tried, it was really just a process which had been fine as a post-race recovery massage. It was just generally a generic trying to loosen up all the muscles, and fine, you leave feeling better. And I think, looking back on it, I know more now what I was looking for. But at the time, I was just thinking, well, that isn't really what I was looking for. I was looking for something that was more trying to help me as a runner, getting through increasing volumes of training, which is what you need to do ultras without getting any problems on the way. So I think what particularly worked for me on the first few visits with you was the analytical approach, which is, my background is I'm a physics graduate. I love to understand how things work, basically. So I would always take an analytical approach, and that's what particularly, was the first tick in the box, if you like, in terms of why I liked it. It was really trying to get to the bottom of not what the niggle was, but why do you have that niggle? And the fact that it was an interactive process, two ways communication. Does this sound right? If not, why not this? And I think just things that was really the core of it, and the use of visualization. I mean, visualization as a technique is something I've used a lot, both in my working career, but also in trail running. Ultra running. It's particularly useful to visualize all sorts of things. With particularly on my last race, going out for 4 days, there's quite a lot that's going to happen, and trying to think through and visualize various aspects of it is immensely useful. So that's a technique you've always used, and I've always found that works for me as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, it is true. I always say, like, if you don't want to know about your body, we're probably not the place to come to, because we do so much conversation. We're really trying to understand, we have to be very theoretical because there's not a ton of evidence base in like the research about how specific we get. But, as far as I'm concerned, if we get the effect that we want and you're feeling better and it repeatedly works, then to me, that's evidence enough. And while we were working together, we had a bit of a flare up with your knee, didn't we?
Yeah.
Kind of earlier on, I want to say. Like you said, sometimes it's so hard to keep track of timelines. Could you share a bit about what happened with your knee, the treatment that you pursued, including, I know you went and saw a physio, which, for anyone listening, we always recommend that if you feel like an osteo or a physio or someone else might help, we like to work together in conjunction with other people. It's not like, oh, well, you can only see us and no one else. But could you share a bit about what happened to your knee, what treatments you had, and what you feel like ultimately was the thing that resolved it?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think, initially when I saw you, I think I hadn't particularly got any particular niggles initially. And I think it was, so I initially saw you at the beginning of 19. I finished for the first time the Lakeland 100 in July that year, and it had gone relatively well. And then later that year, and I still don't really know what sparked it off, I had my right knee swelled up and became very painful. And in most things, sometimes you want to get a number of views. I went to see a physio, who's a very good physio, I have to say, who I'd seen before over the years a couple of times, over previous decades possibly. And they had a suspicion of what it might be, and there's two possibilities. One, it was just a bursitis, and the other, it was just old knees, that your knee meniscuses do degrade over time. And in reality, that's what it turned out almost certainly to be the cause. And his advice was, there are things you can do, exercise you can do to try and strengthen the knee, but it's largely a management issue. But did suggest the possibility of cortisone injections as one way. The physio had been a successful athlete, and had used cortisone injections himself in the past during his athletic career. So basically, I carried on with yourselves trying to work on it. And And in parallel, when it didn't go away as quickly as I liked, I broke and went and had a cortisone injection. In fact, over a 2 year period, I had two, because in the first injection I had was on the basis that perhaps it was bursitis, and that was seemed initially that seemed successful in the sense that it removed the pain, which was sort of lower down the knee, but ultimately didn't, just revealed the real problem, which was actually on the knee joint line. A few months later, it just came back as a problem. And later on, I attempted having an injection at their recommendations of the same guy I saw in London. I had an injection actually in the meniscus, in the knee joint line, and that was an unmitigated disaster. It may work for some people, but it didn't work for me. It basically meant I had to have about 2 months off from running altogether. And in the meantime, I kept on seeing you roughly monthly, 6 weekly. And basically, since then, I've stuck with you. And the knee problems, occasionally get not exactly a flare up, but I get a reminder that my knee's old and has a few tears in the meniscus. But I've never had the problems I've had. Back, I guess it's 2020 was the last time I had a real problem. So from my point of view, I do think, seeing you has been the major reason I've managed the last couple of years without any significant problem in my knee. So, that's part of why my keep one came back, because as far as I'm concerned, it's clearly worked.
Mm. Yeah, and like you said, with the injections, their effects can vary widely. Like I've had some clients where it works so well and it really helps, and I've had other clients where it makes it worse, and then I've had other clients where it's helped, but only for a short period of time. And just to kind of touch on what you were saying about you weren't sure, what had flared it up. As I shared with you in our sessions, one of the things we do see pretty often is when people increase their mileage and increase what they're doing, the small things that their body was able to cope with become bigger things, and then they become flare-ups. And it can be a slow road to get back down because you're having to basically retrain your body. And that was definitely the case, I think, with our work, for the right muscles to activate, to have the support to undo some of the tension that was built up. And so then that can take a while. But I'm really happy that we got to the point where you're basically able, like you said, every once in a while it reminds you it's there, and we can definitely see that it's not like 100% perfect, but it's, that you're able to, run these long distances and have basically pain-free, because we've had a couple of other things come up as well, but for the most part, we've been able to address them. And so if someone is listening to this and they're listening to it because they're trying to decide if we're the right clinic for them to support them in their training, what would you say to someone who's considering working with us?
Well, I think my first view would be, it's worth giving it a try. I mean, I think certainly it's worked for me, and I see no reason why it shouldn't work for other people. I think, I've already mentioned, I think it's the analytical approach to me. It's, trying to understand the root causes rather than just get rid of the pain, actually understand what's the ultimate source of the pain. And I think, and what looking back on it, just really still thinking about it prior to our call now, that clearly it's not just the interventions, it's the advice, and it's the regular checkpoint. When I come and see you, it's another point to think on, have I been doing what I should have been doing? And it just gets your mind in the right place. I'm constantly trying to get yourself in a better place. And I know, having, I work out, it's now probably 4 years I've been seeing you. I know I've got a far more efficient running style than I had. I get virtually no muscular reaction these days after a long training run or a long event. I finished a 4-day, 200-mile event with essentially no sore muscles whatsoever.
Yay.
And and you've clearly had a major input on managing my wonderfully grumbly knee at times. So I think, to me, the benefits are obvious. So I think I would recommend anybody gives it a go. I think obviously in all things, there'll be personal preferences and things that people get on with or don't. But
100%.
I certainly suggest giving it a try.
Yeah, awesome. And so, what I also wanted to do, thank you very much for that, by the way. What I also wanted to do with this is to share some tips since you are, like, I think that because we've worked with ultra runners before, but I don't think I've had anybody who does your distances before, like 100 miles, 300 kilometers. Like, those just numbers, like, wow. So, I thought it would be cool if you were happy to share some of your tips around preparing and managing your energy and stuff like that. So I just have like three questions. I'll just do one and then ask the other and then ask the other. So number one, what kind of training do you do? So not just like you don't have to go into super granular detail, but like, is there any tips around how you manage your runs and or your conditioning? And I just want to say here, you mentioned how when you come to see me, it's a good reminder to do like the self-care that we talk about. And I just have to publicly give you props because you are, and I tell you this all the time, but you are one of the best clients we have when it comes to compliance. You are so good at taking our like the suggestions and like the technique for how to foam roll effectively and do the glute activation. And that is like 100% you. So I have to say you do a great job with that. So yes, if you could share what kind of training do you do or kind of tips around training for people who are looking at training for ultra?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing to say is if anybody is at all interested, it's worth giving it a go. I think now when I look back on many years when I was doing several half marathons a year, it all looks very one-dimensional.
Mm,
And the thing about ultra running and trail running to a certain degree, but certainly the ultra side of it, is that it's far, far more of a multi-dimensional problem. That it isn't just about sort of the physical side and training, hydration and nutrition, which sort of perhaps start becoming important when people do marathons, come to the fore. And then really what comes to the fore is the mental side. That anything over 50 miles is largely a mental side is what comes to the fore. So when people think about training for it, people worry about, train so many miles a week to do a half marathon. What on earth would I need to do? And I think that's far less of an issue. I think while at times I do go up to 60 miles ish a week, I don't do that all the year. So I tend to work sort of an annual calendar of building up towards July, when it's generally late 100 is usually what I would consider my A race. But then other times a year do far less. And that it's I think it's said for half marathons and marathons, the 80-20 rule, that 80% of your running should be low intensity. And that's certainly the case for ultras. It's more important time on feet than actually distance or level of intensity. And, in particular, ultras, by their nature, people worry about them, but the whole point is the further you're going, it is inevitable you're going slower. And particularly my particular thing I like, which is doing ultras in mountainous areas,
mm,
you will end up, a lot of the time you are walking.
mm,
And it makes it a far more varied, far more social activity. And obviously, as you go further and further, checkpoints, which the organisers kindly put on, become quite a
mm,
regular occurrence and quite a social side of it. So I think the main thing I would say in terms of people with an interest in ultras is one, give it a go, and two, don't be put off by the feeling you need to do lots more training. I think the things to focus on are time on your feet rather than intensity, and stopping and starting. I mean, the whole solution or game in ultras is breaking things down into chunks and accepting that you've got to do a first 10K, you're then going to stop, have a cup of tea maybe, and then do another one.
mm,
So it's that stopping and starting, which is good to rehearse in your training. So if people are near the Epping Forest, my standard training routine is to run for an hour or two in Epping Forest, go to one of the tea huts, sit down, have a cup of tea and a cake, and then do it again.
mm.
It'd be my sort of standard Sunday morning long run.
Nice. And conditioning is important though too, right? Like glute
Yeah,
activation.
and I think yes, conditioning is, in terms of preparation, it's probably as much or if not more about conditioning the body to be ready to do these things rather than sort of trying to improve your athletic performance. So, part of it is just getting your feet ready to take the battering that they get in a 24-hour or 4-day race, depending on the lengths that you're talking about. Because at first, that's the major difference: is the body takes a battering, and you just need to condition it to be ready for that.
Mm.
And that's equally true for the mental side. The more you do ultra races, the more you're prepared to take it on, because the body's a wonderful thing. It will send your brain all sorts of interesting messages about why you shouldn't be running at this point of time. And the further you're going, that's the main thing you're battling.
100%.
And
And how important do you feel like the things like the glute activation, the abdominal activation, like lunges and squats and the foam rolling and that kind of self-care is to your preparation?
I think it's vital. I think the thing I found out the first few ultras I did is you get all sorts of sort of strange effects. The first 100 I ended up finished with a lean to one side of about 15%. People thought I was going to fall over. I was quite happy. I just redefined what vertical was. My body was quite happy at a 15-degree sort of standing up at a 15-degree angle. Other people worried I was just about to topple over. No, it's just and it all comes down to, obviously, the longer you're on your feet, core muscles are vital. So in terms of conditioning, I think core exercises are important. And as you mentioned, I mean, I think I've battled since our first meetings of trying to improve my glute activation. Every 6 months, I think I've made sort of big strides forward, and then amazed that 6 months on, I yet again think I've made big strides forward. And and it is something you have to work out continuously. And any time you sort of think, I've got a tick in the box for that, you're probably wrong. Really, you just need, you do need to keep on working these things. So I think, particularly glute activation, core strengthening the core, so you can stand up for days on end, are pretty vital, particularly if you want to go for the very long events. And it's a chicken and egg. I'm a slow runner. I'm never going to be in the first half of the fields at the events I go at. But I probably I finished vast majority of the races I've started. Which, whereas on some of the races, the completion rate is under half.
Oh, wow.
More than half the runners won't finish the race. And so, I think a lot of ultra runners, it's far more of a personal challenge.
Mm-hmm.
The time is almost immaterial. It's finishing the event feeling you've done reasonable, you've had a good run, rather than what time you did. You don't measure it in numbers, you measure it in how you feel.
Yeah, that's true. And then what kinds of things do you pack with you when you're going on your runs? Like, do you have energy gels? And then I'll include in that your tip. I'd love for you to share your tip for preventing trench foot, which we won't describe what that is because it's a little bit gross, but I think you were very successful in protecting your feet. And I know that involves packing. So I think that's a good one to include with this as well.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's sort of two sides to this. One is training and the other is actually in the races. So in races, you do have to be really on top of nutrition and hydration, because if, once you start feeling thirsty or feeling low on energy, while you can do things to recover from that, you've really gone too far. So, and I mean, some of the famous authors whose name I can't remember, but some of the famous books on ultra running, they're described as eating competitions
Mm,
because at the end of the day, if you're out for 24 hours or longer, you cannot eat enough calories to replace those you're expending. So it is about just balancing and doing your best to take on calories and balancing the effort you're expending such you never go too far into the red, but you will be in the red
mm,
quite a long time. In terms, so generally in races, in summer, I could be taking half a liter, drinking half a liter of water an hour is probably at the most extreme. And obviously, most ultras, there are checkpoints, so provision for you to top up with water and food. I tend to be more traditionalist on food. I have tried gels, and I tend to have one or two gels with me, caffeinated gels in particular, but they're usually for dire emergencies.
mm,
And I tend to rely on good old traditional things like flapjacks
mm,
and increasingly savory food.
mm.
My go-to food is salami and Emmental cheese sandwiches would be my go-to food.
Nice.
Um, in training, sometimes it is useful to obviously go with no liquid to see, quite how quickly you start to deteriorate. Because it's one of the things you do have to prepare for.
Mhm,
So often I certainly going out in Epping Forest. If I'm going out for less than 2 hours, I tend not to take any fluids with me at all,
mm,
but may stop for a coffee or a cup of tea. Um, and then in terms of conditioning the feet, um, there's some things in ultra running which is very difficult to give specific advice. One is shoe choice.
mhm,
What you do need to find is a pair of shoes that don't annoy your feet.
mhm,
You'll see all sorts of advice. If you look anywhere, you'll find all sorts of advice on these are good and these are bad. But at the end of the day, you need a pair of shoes that's comfortable and doesn't give you enormous grief.
mhm,
And then you need to use them a lot to prepare your feet. You mentioned trench foot. One of the unavoidable things of running in British hills is getting wet feet.
mhm,
And certainly on the last race I did, uh, which is a Northern Traverse coast to coast part, you were spending hours ploughing through. Most of it was overnight, so a frozen bog.
mhm,
And one of the consequences, if your feet get too wet, is trench foot. Obviously, it's very common in the First World War in the trenches. But I've become quite adept at avoiding that. And the basic routine is to look after your feet in advance. So this quite bizarre process of moisturizing your feet and for a couple of weeks beforehand, and then covering your feet in Sudocrem as used on babies' bottoms.
mhm.
So to try and basically waterproof your feet as much as possible, because the starting point for trench foot is just the skin of your feet just gets soggier and soggier.
So, and when you say that you moisturize your feet, is there like a specific lotion that you like beforehand? Is there a specific lotion that you use? Is it like twice a day?
Cheap as possible moisturizer and once a day, and it's really just to soften, obviously try and remove any hard skin in advance, and really just have your feet in as good as a condition. I mean, just an anecdote relating to that, I pulled a muscle on my last race, the Northern Traverse. Um, and most of the time, at the checkpoints, they have quite a few medics and physios to help with the injured. So I went queued up to see a medic who diagnosed my problem. It wasn't in the end, didn't actually stop me finishing the race. But she was enraptured about the state of my feet. A number of times she said, "Your feet are really good." So it obviously works.
Yeah. Well, I think that's like really good. And I don't know how much advice there's about it, but when you told me about it, and because you said you have a lot of waterproof socks with you as well, so you're changing your socks throughout, do you reapply Sudocrem as well, or do you just put it on at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, I've only for the Northern Traverse, which I was out for just over 4 days.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I was using waterproof socks some of the time. And the problems with waterproof socks is they work for a while, but obviously they don't 100% stop moisture getting through. And obviously they trap in any moisture that does get through.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, any opportunity you can, the socks have got to come off. You've got to dry your feet, and you've got to reapply Sudocrem or any other lubricants, and to try and keep the feet in good condition. And perhaps say, I mean, it's also not just applicable for really long races, in that your feet getting wet is the most common source of blisters.
Mm.
The first thing that happens when the skin gets wet is it becomes less abrasion resistant.
Mm.
So most blisters are caused by people getting damp feet and then the shoe rubbing, because it's a common occurrence. People think, they've done lots of training with no blisters whatsoever, go out on a race, get wet feet, and can't understand why. A couple of hours later, they've got a blister, and that's generally, it's just wet feet is bad news. When we are, it starts off by getting blisters and then gets worse.
Yeah, that's good. That's a really good tip. I hope everyone listens to the end so they can hear that. So thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else that you want to share, or anything that you feel like I should have asked about ultra running or anything like that?
I don't think so. No, I mean, I think, really just to summarise my views. I mean, I found sports massage, and in particular with yourself, Catherine, being, really been the mainstay of the last few years for me, of keeping me on the straight and narrow. And I think I couldn't recommend it high enough, really, that people get different experiences, I know, and it will depend on how old their bodies and how creaky their joints are. But certainly, I think it's something most runners should think about doing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate your time. So, and anyone listening, if you have any questions about anything, or if you'd like more information about our runners MOT or what we offer, I'll put some links down below in this video. And if you enjoyed this audio/video, please like, subscribe, and share, or tag someone you know who's a runner below. And we'll see you in the next video.